A simple stone could once decide your fate. Ancient border stones served as far more than territory markers. They were tools of profound power and deliberate deceit. By the end of this, you will see the hidden language of these stones, understanding how they built empires and broke trust. We will uncover why a king might plant a false boundary and how an entire village could be fooled by a single, moved rock. What do you think it felt like to discover your world was not where you thought it was? That first stone, placed by a farmer's hand, was a declaration. It said, "This land is mine." This act, so simple, was the seed from which empires would grow. As small settlements swelled into towns and then kingdoms, that basic need to mark territory became a matter of survival and power. It was no longer just about one field next to another. It was about controlling water sources, prime hunting grounds, and trade routes. A border meant safety, a defined line that a community could defend. And for this crucial task, stone was the obvious choice. Wood rots, paint fades, but a stone endures. It was a promise made to the future, a permanent witness to an agreement. Yet these stones were far more than just practical signposts. They were believed to be living entities infused with spirit. In many cultures, placing a boundary stone was a sacred ritual. Priests would anoint it with oils, communities would gather to offer prayers, and gods were called upon to guard the line. To move such a stone was not just a crime against your neighbor, it was a sin against the divine. This spiritual weight gave the stone its true authority. It transformed a simple rock into a legal document, a moral covenant, and a sacred object, all in one. The evolution was inevitable. That unmarked stone became a carefully selected boulder. Then, someone had the idea to carve a symbol into its surface, perhaps a clan totem or a god's image. Finally, we arrive at the inscribed stelae of the earliest civilizations, covered in formal writing. This was the moment everything changed. The border was no longer just a local understanding or a tradition passed down through stories. It was now a matter of state record, chiseled into rock for all to see, assuming you could read. This was the birth of the border as we conceptualize it today, a line defined by law and enforced by power. This profound shift from informal marker to official monument set the stage for the clever, and sometimes cruel, deceptions that would follow. Stand before one of these stones, and you were not just looking at a rock, you were reading the law. In ancient Babylon, a formal ceremony might have an official reading the terms of a land grant directly from the inscriptions on the stone itself. This was not a simple marker, it was a contract, a deed of ownership carved into a material meant to last for eternity. The stone gave physical, unyielding form to abstract legal concepts, detailing who owned what land, what rights they had to its water or timber, and the severe penalties awaiting anyone who challenged those facts. To move a border stone was not a petty act of vandalism. It was a direct assault on the entire legal and social order. In many societies, from Mesopotamia to Rome, the punishment for this crime was death. This reflects how deeply ancient civilizations valued territorial integrity. The idea that the stability of the state itself rested on the immovability of its boundaries. The inscriptions made this authority explicit. They named the king who granted the land, invoked the gods who witnessed and sanctified the agreement, and spelled out terrifying curses for any transgressor. A person might read a warning promising that the gods would wipe out their family line or inflict them with a withering disease. This legal and spiritual threat combined to make the landscape itself a text to be read, where every significant stone narrated a story of power, obligation, and divine watchfulness. For an ordinary farmer, these markers dictated the rhythm of their entire existence, defining where they could plow their fields, where their animals could graze, and under whose jurisdiction they lived. This immense legal power, however, was rooted in something even deeper than royal decree. It drew its ultimate strength from the belief that these stones were alive with spiritual presence. That sacred oil anointing the stone was far more than just a ceremony. It was an act of summoning. In the minds of the people, they were not merely blessing a rock, they were inviting a divine guardian to take up residence within it. This transformed the border marker into a living entity, a sentinel standing between two worlds. On one side lay the known universe, the cultivated fields, the familiar homes, and the rule of law. On the other side stretched the untamed wilderness, a realm of chaos, danger, and the unknown. The border stone was the ultimate threshold, the literal and metaphysical line where order met chaos. This belief was central from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Inscriptions did not just list fines or punishments, they called upon gods by name. A typical warning might invoke a deity like Shamash, the Mesopotamian god of justice, to strike down any person who dared to move the marker. The threat was not just a legal penalty, but a divine curse promising the utter destruction of one's family and future. This spiritual consequence layered a deep psychological fear over the simple act of trespass. Imagine being a farmer whose plow accidentally nicked the edge of a neighbor's field. Your worry would not only be about a lawsuit, but about inviting a supernatural plague upon your entire household. This sacred connection was renewed annually in festivals like the Roman Terminalia. Each year, communities would gather at their boundary stones. They would decorate them with garlands, make offerings of grain and wine, and reaffirm their shared commitment to the line that both divided and united them. This ritual tied the community's very identity to the physical landscape, making the border a part of their collective soul. The stone was no longer just an object in the ground, it was a covenant. This profound fusion of the divine and the territorial made the landscape itself a holy text. But what happens when that sacred text is written with a deliberate lie? This immense spiritual power, intended to create permanence and trust, could also be twisted into a weapon of breathtaking deception. A king's power does not truly exist until it is carved into the earth itself. When the Roman Emperor Augustus stood on a freshly conquered hilltop, watching his soldiers sink a massive stone into the soil, he was not merely marking a boundary. He was performing an act of political theater. That stone was a declaration, a permanent advertisement of his authority meant for two audiences. For his new subjects, it was an unavoidable reminder that their old loyalties were obsolete. For his rivals, it was a stark warning that this land was now under the protection of Rome's legions. The border stone became the physical proof of a ruler's claim, transforming the entire landscape into a map of his ambition. This was propaganda in its most durable form. The scale and artistry of these markers were never accidental. A simple, unadorned rock might suffice for a dispute between two farmers, but an empire demanded monuments. In the vast expanses of the Assyrian Empire, rulers commissioned towering stone stelae covered in intricate reliefs. These were not placed in city centers where everyone could easily see them. They were erected at the very edges of the kingdom, in remote and often hostile territories. A local tribesman or a foreign merchant, traveling for days through wilderness, would suddenly come upon one of these immense carvings. It would depict the Assyrian king in magnificent detail, often shown receiving tribute from kneeling, defeated enemies. The message was immediate and unmistakable. You are now entering the domain of a power so great it can project its image here to the very end of the known world. The border was no longer just a line on the ground. It was the leading edge of an entire political system. For the people living within these bounds, the stones were a constant, silent education in who held ultimate control. Your village elder might settle local disputes, but that stone at the edge of your fields represented the distant king whose laws ultimately governed your harvest, your taxes, and your life. This daily, visible presence of sovereign power shaped political identity itself, teaching people where they belonged in a vast hierarchy. It answered the fundamental question of ancient governance, whose law runs here with uncompromising clarity. This deep connection between geography and control explains the ferocious punishments for tampering with a marker. To move a border stone was not just theft, it was an act of sedition, a direct challenge to the state's fundamental claim to authority. And it is precisely because these stones held such immense power that they also became irresistible targets for a far more subtle and insidious form of attack. A Roman terminus was far more than a rock in a field. It was a feat of engineering and law designed to be seen, understood, and most importantly, to endure. It began its life as a rough block of local limestone, but craftsmen would carefully square it off, creating clean, defined edges. This transformation from a natural boulder to a geometric form was the first signal of human order imposed upon the wild landscape. The portion that stood above the soil was just the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface, a massive, tapered base was buried deep, anchoring the stone so firmly that moving it would require a team of laborers and a great deal of time, making clandestine theft nearly impossible. This physical permanence was a direct reflection of the legal permanence it was meant to represent. The true power of the stone, however, was etched into its face. The inscriptions were not casual scratches. They were carved in a formal, legible script, a deliberate act of public communication. A typical marker would name the emperor or the local magistrate who had certified the boundary, listing their full titles to emphasize the weight of the authority behind the line. It would state the date of its placement, anchoring the claim in a specific moment in time, and provide a precise description of the territory. This was not a vague suggestion. It was a legal document meant to settle disputes for generations. More sophisticated markers went even further, incorporating symbols of the ruling power. An eagle for Rome, a lotus for Egypt, or the image of a local god served as a constant, silent reminder of who guaranteed this border and which divine forces watched over it. This level of detail was not universal. The design of a border stone spoke volumes about the culture that created it. In Celtic territories, an unadorned standing stone, chosen for its natural imposing presence, was often sufficient. Its power came from tradition and local recognition, not written law. In stark contrast, an ancient Egyptian stela at the edge of the empire would be a masterpiece of sculpture, covered in intricate hieroglyphs and reliefs depicting the pharaoh making offerings to the gods. Here, the border was a sacred space, and the marker was a temple in miniature. Even the choice of material was a calculated decision. For the boundaries of an empire, only the hardest stones would do, granite or basalt hauled from distant quarries to signify the unyielding nature of imperial power. For a simple farmstead, a piece of softer, local sandstone was adequate. This evolution from a simple marker to a complex, inscribed monument mirrors the growth of ancient bureaucracy itself. The immense care and resources poured into these objects revealed just how much was at stake. They were the bedrock of property, law, and identity, and that is precisely why someone would go to the trouble of creating a perfect replica, designed from the very beginning to tell a lie. A single stone could draw an enemy army into a fatal trap. Military strategists quickly realized that the very authority society vested in border markers made them perfect instruments of deception. A cunning commander like Hannibal would have grasped this immediately. By having his engineers plant false Carthaginian boundary stones deep in territory he did not truly control, he created a brilliant illusion. Roman scouts encountering these official-looking markers would report back that Hannibal's influence extended far further than anyone had suspected. This phantom border could lure legions into ambushes, forcing them to march through terrain where they were at a disadvantage, all because they trusted the story the stones told. The border became a psychological weapon, a cheap and effective way to manipulate an enemy's perception and movement. This tactic was not limited to ambushes. Fake markers could fabricate an entire phantom buffer zone. Imagine a rival kingdom preparing to advance. Suddenly finding a series of stones claiming the land ahead is a protected neutral territory under a powerful ally's control. This would force them to halt, to send envoys for verification, to reconsider their entire strategy. The invaders' momentum would dissolve into confusion and delay, all bought with a few cleverly placed rocks. In other scenarios, the deception was more direct and provocative. An invading army might quietly shift the genuine border stones of a neutral state a few hundred paces into a rival's land. When the rival discovered this apparent land grab, it could easily be framed as an act of aggression, providing the perfect excuse or casus belli for a war the invader had already planned. Why was this trick so effective? In an age before accurate maps, soldiers and scouts relied on what they could see on the ground. A stone marker, worn by weather and seemingly ancient, carried an aura of objective truth. It was a trusted witness, and its testimony could shape military campaigns. This was especially potent in rugged, poorly mapped frontiers where a false border, once planted, could go unchallenged for years, silently redirecting trade, settlement, and military patrols. The success of the entire scheme relied on that fundamental, widespread trust in the stone's permanence and honesty. This military trickery reveals borders not as passive lines but as active, malleable tools in the theater of war. And where armies used stones to conquer land, others would soon use them to steal wealth. That wealthy landowner, watching his neighbor's olive grove after a flood, saw more than damaged land. He saw an opportunity. In the chaos of receding waters, with familiar landmarks buried under mud, who would notice if the boundary stone was placed just a few paces farther onto his neighbor's property? This was not warfare, but a quiet, calculated theft for economic gain. The border stone, that sacred object of law and divine witness, became the perfect tool for resource grabbing. For a powerful individual or a greedy state, a clandestine nudge of a marker could annex acres of the most fertile soil, redirect a vital water channel, or claim access to a newly discovered vein of precious metal. In a world built on agriculture, land was wealth, and moving a stone was the simplest way to steal it. The fraud was devastatingly effective because it was so difficult to prove. Imagine a farmer, year after year, noticing his harvests are slightly smaller, his fields seemingly a bit more cramped. He might blame poor soil or bad luck, never suspecting that the ancient stone at the edge of his land had been subtly repositioned by a wealthy rival under cover of night. The slow creep of a boundary could transfer generations of wealth from one family to another without a single drawn sword. This deception also twisted the machinery of the state. In ancient empires, tax collection was intrinsically tied to territory. A regional governor's assessment, the amount of grain or gold he owed to the distant king, was calculated based on the mapped boundaries of his province. If he could quietly shift the markers separating his land from a less powerful neighbor, he could effectively shrink his own tax burden while inflating his rivals. The neighboring community would then face crippling demands from the royal treasury for resources they never actually possessed. a financial siege engineered with a few moved rocks. We have direct evidence of this from Babylonian law codes, where kings were forced to dispatch special commissions to investigate disputed boundaries. These royal investigators would travel from village to village, often discovering that local magnates had not made a simple, honest mistake. They had systematically and deliberately repositioned stones over many years, slowly consolidating smaller farms into vast, illegal private estates. The technological limitations of the time were the fraudster's greatest ally. Without precise maps or standardized measuring tools, a boundary dispute often came down to one person's word against another's, and the word of a wealthy, powerful landowner usually carried more weight than that of a simple farmer. This economic motivation strips away any romantic notion of the border stone as a purely sacred object. It reveals it as a pawn in a relentless game of greed and power, a game where the highest stakes were personal profit. What kind of person, then, would risk divine curses and royal punishment for such a selfish prize? The answer lies deep within the human psyche, in the dark temptations that even a stone cannot withstand. A paranoid pharaoh understood that true control was not just about armies, but about what people believed. He could plant a terrifying, curse-laden stone in the heart of a restless province, far from any real frontier. This marker was not meant to define a boundary. It was a weapon of psychological warfare, designed to create an atmosphere of constant surveillance and dread. For the local farmer, that stone was a daily, silent message. It told him that the eyes of the king and his gods were upon this village, that any whisper of rebellion would be seen and punished. The border stone, stripped of its original function, became a pure symbol of oppression, its spiritual power twisted into a tool for social control. This manipulation of space was a deliberate strategy to break the will of a population. By saturating the landscape with intimidating markers, a ruler could make his subjects feel perpetually hemmed in and isolated from potential allies. The world itself seemed to shrink around them, making the idea of organized resistance feel not only dangerous but futile. In other instances, the deception was one of false comfort. A king might establish a line of impressive border stones far inside his kingdom's actual defensible frontier. His citizens, seeing these formidable markers, would believe they enjoyed a vast, safe buffer zone against external enemies. This manufactured sense of security boosted public morale and reinforced the image of the ruler as a powerful protector, even if the real border was much closer and more vulnerable. The most devastating psychological blow, however, was the act of erasure. When a conquering army swept through a region, they did not just kill soldiers and install new governors. They systematically sought out and destroyed the ancient boundary stones of the conquered people. This was more than vandalism. It was a symbolic annihilation. Those stones were the physical anchors of a community's history, the records of ancestral land grants and tribal agreements that stretched back generations. To smash them was to tell the survivors that their past no longer mattered, that their identity was now irrelevant under the new regime. Their world, as they had known it, was literally unmade. This constant, visible presence of manipulated markers, whether through false placement, intimidating design, or deliberate removal, exerted a soft power that was often more effective than brute force. It shaped reality itself through perception, teaching people the limits of their freedom without a single word being spoken. The chilling genius of these deceptions forces us to ask a final, critical question. With so much deception surrounding them, how did anyone ever prove a border was a lie? The sheer audacity of the Roman bluff is laid bare in the misty highlands of Britain. There, along the wild northern fringes of the empire, Archaeologists have unearthed clusters of boundary stones that are perfect in every detail, except for one thing. They were never authorized by Rome. These markers, known as termini, bear the full, formal inscription of the emperor, his titles crisply carved as if by an official stonecutter. They stand exactly where you would expect a Roman border marker to stand, proud and imposing. Yet, imperial land registries back in Rome contain no record of a legal boundary in that specific location. The Romans, masters of law and order, were systematically planting fakes. This was not the work of rogue soldiers or local fraudsters. This was a calculated policy of imperial deception. In regions like the Scottish borders or the vast North African limes, where the terrain was difficult and local tribes were restless, the Roman military erected these placeholder boundaries. They were a brilliant, cost-effective solution to the problem of governing a sprawling empire. Why station expensive legions in every remote valley when you could use the empire's own reputation to do the work for you? A local chieftain, seeing an official-looking Roman stone at the edge of his territory, would naturally assume a full Roman administration lay just beyond it. The marker created a psychological barrier far stronger than any wooden palisade. It projected an image of invincible, omnipresent order, discouraging raids and incursions before they even started. The genius was in the authenticity. The stones were perfect replicas, indistinguishable from the real thing to anyone who could not travel to a central archive. They exploited the universal trust in the Roman system to enforce a border that was, in reality, a complete fiction. This was information warfare on a grand scale, where the perception of control was a weapon that allowed Rome to command a larger territory with far fewer resources. The landscape itself became a stage for a magnificent bluff. This sophisticated use of stone as propaganda finds a startling echo thousands of miles away in the sun-baked empires of the ancient Near East. A Babylonian Kudurru was not a simple marker you could trip over in a field. It was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation, standing as a polished black stone monument covered in a dizzying array of divine symbols and tightly packed cuneiform script. To the common farmer, this object was an article of faith. He could not read the intricate writing, and the carvings of gods like Shamash and Ishtar were powerful but silent. He had to trust that the stone protected his land as promised. For the elite priest or official who received it, however, the Kudurru was something else entirely, a dangerously complex legal contract carved in stone. It granted vast tracts of tax-free land, a gift from the king for loyal service, but the true meaning of that gift was often locked away in the stone's own complexity. The descriptions of the land boundaries could be deliberately vague, using archaic terms for geographical features that no longer existed or referencing landmarks open to multiple interpretations. Some Kudurrus even featured conflicting divine symbols, where the emblem of one god of justice was placed beside the symbol of another god associated with chaotic change, creating a theological contradiction that mirrored the legal ambiguity written below. This was not an accident. The granting authority, usually the royal court, designed these stones with built-in loopholes. A loyal official might one day fall from favor, or a temple might grow too powerful and independent. When that happened, the state could point to the vague wording or the conflicting divine mandates on the very Kudurru they had issued, using its own deliberate obscurity as the legal grounds to revoke the land grant or demand new, burdensome services. The farmer working the land would never know if the stone that defined his world was actually a carefully laid trap for his master. This system created a landscape of profound legal insecurity. There are surviving court records that describe two wealthy nobles, both presenting seemingly valid Kudurrus that granted them the same lucrative field. This suggests that corrupt officials within the bureaucracy sometimes issued duplicate stones, collecting bribes from multiple parties for the same royal favor. How could such a fraud be proven? The sheer complexity of the inscriptions meant that only a handful of elite scribes in the entire kingdom could authoritatively interpret them, and their loyalties, of course, lay with the powerful. The terrifying religious curses carved at the base of every Kudurru served a dual purpose. They warned against physical tampering, but they also served as a powerful psychological deterrent against questioning the stone's authority. To scrutinize the inscription too closely, to publicly debate its ambiguous clauses, was to risk inviting the wrath of the gods themselves. This intimidation kept the beneficiaries compliant and prevented them from challenging the hidden vulnerabilities baked into their own property deeds. The Kudurru represents the ultimate perversion of the border stone's purpose. It used the appearance of permanence and divine sanction to create not clarity, but controlled confusion. It was a tool that allowed the powerful to give with one hand while secretly keeping the right to take away with the other, proving that the most sophisticated deceptions are not written in sand, but carved in stone for all to see, yet for few to truly understand. A simple knotted rope held the power to define an empire's edge. In ancient Egypt, the surveyor known as the rope stretcher performed a sacred duty, using a cord with evenly spaced knots to measure the land after the Nile's annual flood. Yet this tool, for all its ritual importance, was profoundly vulnerable. A strong wind could twist the rope, a sloping hill could stretch it taut over a shorter true distance, and a tired or bribed official could simply pull the cord a little tighter on one end. The accuracy of the entire system rested on fallible human senses and a length of fiber. This was not a problem unique to Egypt. For centuries, surveyors across the ancient world relied on line of sight, measured chains, and the unpredictable paths of rivers. A border defined by following a stream could shift dramatically with a single season of heavy rains, leaving two communities arguing over suddenly unfamiliar ground. These methods created an inherent margin of error, a gray zone of uncertainty around every official boundary. Within this nebulous space, deception found fertile ground. An unscrupulous landowner could easily bribe a surveyor to nudge a marker just outside the margin of error, a distance small enough to be plausible, yet large enough to annex a valuable spring or a strip of rich farmland. The instructions themselves were often part of the problem. A boundary described as running from the large rock to the gnarled oak tree was a future dispute waiting to happen. Which large rock? What if there were two gnarled oaks? This ambiguity was a gift to anyone looking to manipulate the system. The most critical weakness was the lack of a centralized map. There was no overhead satellite image, no master document filed in a capital city to consult. The border stone itself was often the only legal record of where the line was drawn. This placed an almost impossible weight of trust on a single, physical object that could be moved, damaged, or replaced. The entire concept of a fixed border was, in many ways, an illusion built on fragile technology. This inherent fragility of measurement forced communities to rely on something beyond ropes and stones, leading to the powerful stories and superstitions that grew like vines around these contested spaces. That old stone at the edge of the village was not just a landmark, it was a character in a ghost story told for generations. A Mesopotamian mother, pointing toward the weathered rock, would warn her child not of a human god, but of a slumbering demon bound to the stone by ancient magic. The story went that if anyone disturbed its rest, the demon would rise, bringing sickness to the family and blight to the fields. This was not just a tale to frighten children into obedience, it was a crucial layer of communal security. To protect the integrity of their boundaries, ancient societies wrapped them in terrifying layers of supernatural threat. The most explicit of these warnings were the curses themselves, chiseled directly into the stone for all to see, or at least for all who could read to interpret for the others. A typical inscription might call upon a god like Shamash to afflict the boundary mover with a withering disease, to destroy his family line, ensuring he had no descendants, or to condemn his soul to eternal suffering in the underworld. The potential cost of deception was made to seem astronomically high, a divine death sentence for a terrestrial crime. These curses were far more than mere superstition. They functioned as a sophisticated form of psychological and spiritual enforcement in a society where divine intervention was considered a real, observable force in the world. A sudden plague, a failed harvest, a stillborn child, any misfortune could be interpreted as the delayed but certain fulfillment of a stone's curse. This belief created a powerful, self-policing mechanism. The entire community became invested in the stone's immovability, not just out of respect for the law, but out of a shared fear of attracting divine retribution upon everyone. Folktales and local legends naturally sprang up around particularly old or important markers, reinforcing this fear. People would speak in hushed tones of a neighboring village that suffered a terrible fire after its chieftain tried to shift a boundary, or of a wealthy merchant whose family line mysteriously died out after he built a wall too close to a sacred stone. These stories, passed down through generations, served as constant, chilling reminders. For the common farmer who could not read the intricate legal inscriptions, this rich oral tradition was the law. He understood the language of fear and communal memory far better than the language of royal scribes. This entire cultural machinery, from the formal curse to the whispered ghost story, was a brilliant deterrent for the average person. Its effectiveness, however, crumbled when faced with a different kind of individual, one motivated not by superstition, but by cold, calculated greed or political ambition. The cynical noble or the invading general often saw these divine threats not as a warning, but as a challenge. The belief in these curses reveals the profound lengths to which societies went to sanctify their most important agreements, attempting to make the land itself an ally in the pursuit of order. Yet for some, even the threat of eternal damnation was a price worth paying for a few more acres of power. A bitter harvest awaited the two villages, their shared path now a no-man's land of suspicion. The moved boundary stone did more than steal a strip of land. It severed the bonds of kinship and cooperation that had sustained both communities for generations. Where there was once intermarriage, now there were only shouted accusations across a newly contested field. Cousins no longer spoke, and shared festivals were abandoned. The social fabric, woven over lifetimes, was torn apart in an instant, proving that the most devastating cost of a false border was not measured in acres, but in broken human connections. This paralysis of community spirit quickly bled into the local economy. Farmers, terrified of investing their labor in soil that might be seized, let fields lie fallow. Herders, fearing confrontation, avoided ancestral grazing routes, leaving their animals to grow thin. The shared irrigation channel that once watered both villages' crops became a focal point of conflict, its flow guarded and hoarded. The entire local economy, a delicate ecosystem of mutual dependence, began to starve. The dispute demanded resolution, forcing the communities to turn to their systems of justice. Village councils were convened and elders were called to render judgment, but these proceedings often deepened the divisions. A decision seen as favoring one family over another could create lasting resentment. Accusations of bribery would fly, and the impartiality of the elders themselves would be questioned. The very process meant to heal the community could become another source of its decay, as the original crime of a moved stone gave way to the enduring poison of perceived favoritism. For an external power, this internal strife was a strategic opportunity. A cunning imperial official seeking to subdue a restive region might quietly encourage a boundary dispute between two villages. By dividing them against each other, he ensured they would never unite against his own authority. This ancient tactic of divide and rule used the landscape itself as a weapon, transforming neighbors into enemies and making a once proud community easier to control and tax. The psychological atmosphere in such a place became unbearable. The trust that is the essential glue of any community evaporated, replaced by a constant, wearying vigilance. Every glance from a neighbor was scrutinized for hostility, every conversation passed for hidden meaning. The border stone, once a symbol of shared order, now stood as a monument to collective betrayal. These social dynamics reveal the ultimate truth about ancient borders. They were not merely lines on the land, but lines drawn directly through human relationships. To manipulate them was to attack the community itself, inflicting a wound that could fester for generations, a stark reminder that these deceptions were never victimless crimes. Her brush moves with delicate precision, uncovering the carved surface of a boundary stone, but her triumph is shadowed by doubt. Is this the authentic voice of the past, or a clever forgery planted to mislead? For archaeologists, every unearthed marker presents this fundamental dilemma. The stone in front of them is silent on whether it rests in its original, sacred position, or was shoved here by a deceitful hand 2,000 years ago. Natural forces are constant conspirators in this confusion. A slow, relentless process of soil erosion can tilt a stone, sliding it down a hillside over centuries. A farmer's plow, striking the same obstruction year after year, can gradually push it, inch by painful inch, into a new configuration. Later construction, whether a medieval road or a modern pipeline, can unceremoniously discard these ancient sentinels, leaving them scattered and out of context. The physical evidence itself is often an unreliable witness. This is why the epigrapher, the specialist who deciphers ancient inscriptions, must become a forensic detective. They do not just read the words carved into the rock, they read the rock itself. They study the pattern of weathering on the inscribed faces. Is the wear even, suggesting centuries of steady exposure, or is one side curiously fresh, hinting it lay buried and protected while its other half was exposed? They analyze the stone's mineral composition. Does it match the local geology, or was it hauled from a distant quarry, indicating its placement was a significant official event? They check its alignment with other landscape features mentioned in the text: a lost river bend, the foundation of a watchtower, searching for a logical consistency that either confirms its story or reveals the lie. Sometimes the landscape offers its own testimony long after the stones are gone. Scientific techniques like soil phosphate analysis can detect the ghost of an ancient boundary. Human and animal habitation enriches soil with phosphates, creating an invisible chemical signature. A clear, linear change in phosphate levels running across a field, even with no visible remains, can betray where a fence or wall once stood, a permanent stain of human activity that outlasts the physical marker. The discovery of multiple, conflicting stones for the same boundary is the ultimate red flag. It is the archaeological equivalent of finding two signed deeds for the same house, a clear signal that someone, long ago, was playing a duplicitous game. This painstaking, multi-layered investigation is what finally separates the official state narrative, boldly carved in stone, from the messy, manipulative reality of ancient power struggles. The slow, careful work of these scholarly detectives does more than just map forgotten territories. It exposes the timeless human impulses behind them. The stark warning in the Book of Proverbs echoes across cultures: a testament to a fear that haunted the ancient world. Do not move an ancient boundary stone set up by your forefathers. This was not just moral advice, it was a direct reflection of a rampant, real-world crime. From the Nile Valley to the Roman Forum, legal and literary texts are filled with the same urgent refrain. Egyptian pharaohs issued decrees publicly shaming and punishing officials caught misplacing markers. The famous Babylonian Code of Hammurabi dedicates multiple laws to the crime, with one statute explicitly stating that if a man has moved a boundary stone, they shall cut off his hand and he shall pay a crushing fine. The punishment was so severe because the crime struck at the heart of social order. Greek poets like Hesiod took a different approach, using verse to instruct farmers on the virtues of honest labor and the disgrace that would fall upon a man who stole land from his neighbor by shifting a stone. These texts are the smoking gun, the written proof that confirms the silent conspiracy of the stones we dig up today. They reveal a profound cultural anxiety, a universal recognition that the line between mine and yours was perpetually under threat. This literary evidence allows historians to hear the voices of the people who lived with these stones, their laws and their poems giving us the motive and the means behind the physical evidence. The consistency of this theme across empires and centuries points to a fundamental human challenge, the eternal temptation of the quick, quiet theft. These ancient authors were documenting a battle between order and chaos, a battle fought one stone at a time. That final, decisive handshake between two kings over a map of empty space was an act of pure faith. They were agreeing to a line that neither could see, a boundary that existed only in their minds and in the ink on parchment. This was the ultimate evolution of the border stone, the moment the physical object was no longer necessary because its symbolic power had become so immense it could stand alone. The journey from a rock in the soil to a line on a map represents one of humanity's great intellectual leaps. It required people to stop thinking of territory as merely the land between this river and that mountain, and to start conceptualizing it as an abstract, measurable space that could be divided, traded, and governed from a distance. This mental shift made modern diplomacy possible. Ambassadors in distant palaces could now negotiate the fate of continents they had never visited, arguing over meridians and watersheds, because they shared a common understanding that land was a quantifiable political entity. The symbolism of the stone was so potent that it transferred seamlessly to these new mediums. A wax seal on a treaty, a signature on a document, these acts carried the same solemn weight as the ancient ritual of anointing a boundary marker with oil. They were all covenants, promises made visible, yet this new abstraction also created a far more sophisticated playground for deception. With a physical stone, a fraud required muscle and stealth under the cover of night. But with a border defined by a map, the deception could be engineered in a comfortable office with a pen. A cartographer, subtly bribed or acting under orders, could shift a line a few millimeters on a chart, a tiny alteration that translated to miles of contested territory on the ground. A surveyor could use an inaccurate instrument or deliberately miscalculate a longitude, creating a flawed baseline that would poison every subsequent measurement. Forged documents could surface, claiming to be lost royal decrees that granted lands which had never been in dispute. These were deceptions on an industrial scale, impossible in an era when every border had to be personally witnessed and marked with a heavy, tangible object. The legacy of this evolution is the world we live in today, a planet carved into nation-states by invisible lines. When you cross from one country to another, you are not stepping over a physical barrier, but passing through a conceptual threshold that exists because of a collective agreement, a treaty, a map. Our modern world, with its satellite surveillance and GPS coordinates, still grapples with the exact same ancient problems of trust, power, and deception that plagued the farmer and his neighbor. We have simply traded the chisel for the cartographer's pen, proving that the most enduring borders were never made of stone but of ideas. A desperate hunger can reshape a person's entire moral universe. Picture an ancient farmer, his family's bellies hollow from a failed harvest, staring at the boundary stone separating his withered field from his wealthy neighbor's unused fallow land. That small patch of earth could mean the difference between life and death for his children. To move the stone just a few hand spans would be a crime, a sin condemned by priests and kings alike. But in that moment of profound need, was it an act of theft or one of survival? This is the stark ethical dilemma at the heart of border deception, where the absolute line between right and wrong begins to blur under the weight of human desperation. For the powerful, shifting a border was a simple transaction of greed. A king or a land baron saw territory as a commodity to be acquired, his actions causing suffering he would never have to witness. His moral calculus was cold and clear, the potential profit far outweighing any abstract divine curse. But for the poor and the disenfranchised, the same act could be a raw form of resistance. When the system of land ownership or taxation is itself oppressive, when a corrupt governor demands grain you cannot grow on the land you are allotted, moving a stone becomes a silent rebellion. It is the only tool available to correct a perceived injustice, to claw back a fragment of dignity from a system designed to crush it. Ancient religious and philosophical texts from Babylon to China wrestle with this very tension. They universally condemn the act of moving a boundary stone, labeling it a grievous sin against the gods and the community. Yet, woven through these condemnations is a persistent thread of empathy for the poor and a fierce criticism of the rich who exploit them. The texts seem to acknowledge that while the deed itself is wrong, the conditions that drive a person to it are often a greater evil. This ethical ambiguity is not a relic of the past. It echoes in every modern debate over immigration, resource distribution, and territorial disputes. When is a border a necessary structure for order, and when is it an unjust barrier that perpetuates inequality? The ancient farmer's desperate choice holds up a mirror to our own world, forcing us to ask who truly holds the power to draw the lines that define our lives, and what moral responsibility comes with that power. The temptation to redraw the map of our existence, whether for a meal or for an empire, appears to be a permanent feature of the human heart. Your property deed is a direct inheritance from those ancient stones. Buried at the corners of your land, you will likely find iron pins or concrete monuments placed by a surveyor. These unassuming markers are the modern equivalents of the Roman Terminus or the Babylonian Kudurru. They serve the exact same purpose, transforming an abstract legal right into a physical, locatable point on the earth. Our entire system of property law, with its titles and registries, rests upon this ancient principle that a permanent object can make an invisible boundary real. This is not a mere historical curiosity. It is the living foundation of modern ownership. The crimes we now call encroachment or the fraudulent moving of a survey marker are direct descendants of those ancient laws that promised death for shifting a sacred stone. The entire profession of land surveying, with its licensed practitioners and rigorous standards, evolved as a direct institutional response to the deceptions of the past. It is a system designed to replace fallible ropes and bribable officials with unassailable measurement, building trust into the very process of defining space. Our modern tools have simply magnified this precision. Global positioning system technology and satellite imagery have dramatically reduced the potential for the old-fashioned physical fraud of moving a marker under cover of night. Yet, for all our technological advancement, the legal framework has not fundamentally changed. We still argue in court over the precise location of a metal pin, just as ancient farmers argued over a carved rock. This is why a dispute over a few inches of land between neighbors can escalate into a bitter, financially draining legal war. The stakes feel so high because they are rooted in a struggle thousands of years old. That primal connection between a marked line and our sense of security, our wealth, and our identity remains as powerful today as it was in Babylon. The ancient conflict between the clarity of a fixed boundary and the temptation to deceive has literally shaped the landscape of our lives, proving that the legacy of those simple stones is the very ground beneath our feet. A Greek Horos stone whispered a different kind of truth, while an Imperial border stone shouted the law for all to hear. A simple Horos marker in Athens might state quietly that this land was pledged as security for a loan. It was not primarily about territory, but about debt and personal obligation. This stone was a public notice, a warning to potential buyers that the property was encumbered, its ownership conditional. Its power was economic, not imperial. It marked a temporary state of affairs that could change when the debt was paid and the stone was removed, a flexibility unthinkable for a permanent Roman boundary. This contrast reveals a spectrum of ancient marking. At one end stood the official, unyielding border stone, an instrument of state control designed to last for eternity. At the other end were markers for profoundly personal or communal purposes. A Celtic standing stone, often an imposing, unshaped monolith, might demarcate a chieftain's burial mound. Its purpose was sacred, connecting the living community to the ancestors and the spirit world. Its authority came not from a written inscription, but from generations of tradition and local memory. The materials and forms were a direct reflection of these different functions. A state border required hard stone, precise inscriptions, and standardized shapes to convey its legal weight. A boundary for a weekly market, however, might be denoted by a series of smaller, uncarved rocks known only to the vendors and locals. A family's tombstone was personal, its design reflecting their wealth and taste rather than a bureaucratic template. The consequences of deception shifted with each marker's purpose. To fake a religious boundary, like moving the stones around a sacred grove, was to risk provoking the immediate and terrifying wrath of the local deity. The fear was spiritual and communal. Conversely, faking a commercial boundary, like shifting the marker for a marketplace to avoid taxes, was a simple crime of fraud, punishable by human law and a fine. The border stone occupied a unique and powerful middle ground. It carried the spiritual threat of the sacred marker, layered with the absolute force of state law. It was the only type of marker where a single act of deception could simultaneously be considered a sin against the gods and an act of treason against the king. This comparison shows that the human urge to mark space was not a single impulse, but a diverse cultural language. From the sacred to the commercial to the personal, ancient people used the landscape to write the stories of their lives, their beliefs, and their economies. The border stone was the most politically charged chapter in that story, a tool specifically forged for the difficult task of building and maintaining empires. Its unique blend of spiritual and legal authority made it both a pillar of order and a uniquely tempting target for the lie. That familiar stone was a fixed point in a shifting world, a promise that the landscape made sense. For an ancient traveler, spotting its weathered shape on the horizon meant more than just knowing where one territory ended and another began. It offered a profound psychological anchor, confirming they were on the right path, under the known protection of a certain king's law, and moving through a universe governed by order. This was the unspoken contract of trust. The traveler trusted that the community had maintained the marker, that the governing authority had placed it honestly and that the gods still watched over it. Their entire cognitive map, their mental picture of the world and their safe place within it, was validated by that single, silent stone. To then discover the stone was a fake was a violation that ran far deeper than any property line. It was not merely being lost, it was the chilling realization that the world itself was untrustworthy. The solid ground of reality seemed to give way, replaced by a disorienting uncertainty. If this stone, this fundamental piece of the world's structure, was a lie, what else could not be believed? The local chieftain who swore oaths, the tax collector's assessments, the very words of the priests, all of it suddenly fell under a cloud of suspicion. This ancient experience mirrors our modern confrontation with fake news, where a single exposed falsehood can shatter faith in entire institutions, breeding a corrosive, generalized skepticism. The crime of moving a border stone was therefore an assault on the mind itself. It attacked the foundational maps people used to navigate not only physical space, but social and political reality. This explains the terrifying severity of the punishments, from Hammurabi's code demanding a severed hand to the elaborate curses invoking plagues and eternal suffering. Society was not just protecting dirt and timber, it was defending a core element of mental stability, the basic trust that allows a community to function. When that trust was broken, the very idea of a shared, knowable world began to crumble. The landscape itself had become a liar. A genuine Roman terminus in a museum case is not a dead relic. It is a witness waiting to testify. Its Latin inscriptions are not just words, they are a voice from the past, speaking of ambition, conflict, and the quiet thrill of a successful lie. Each surviving border stone is a time capsule, and its true story is told not only by the words carved into its face, but by its physical body, the scars it carries, and the very ground from which it was pulled. A stone discovered in splendid isolation, miles from any known Roman road or settlement, raises an immediate suspicion. Why was it placed here in this empty valley? It suggests a bluff, a marker planted not to define a real, populated frontier, but to project an illusion of control over land the empire did not truly hold. The stone itself becomes evidence of a grand strategic deception. Other stones tell a different story through their wear. If the base is unevenly weathered, showing signs of having been reset multiple times, it speaks of a long and bitter history of dispute. This stone was not a fixed point of order, it was a prize in a tug of war, fought over by generations of farmers or rival chieftains. Every fresh scrape on its surface marks another argument, another midnight effort to shift the line of ownership. Sometimes the inscription holds the clue. An expert epigrapher might spot an internal contradiction, where the name of an emperor does not match the dating formula used, or a later hand has clumsily added a clause over an erased section. This is the fingerprint of the forger, caught in the act centuries after the crime. Modern technology now acts as the ultimate cross-examination for these ancient witnesses. Museums employ high-resolution, three-dimensional scanning to create digital models of each stone. This process reveals microscopic tool marks, identifying the specific chisel used by the original carver and distinguishing it from the work of a later imitator. It can map patterns of erosion, proving which side of the stone faced the prevailing wind and rain for centuries, and which was protected because it was buried, confirming whether it truly stood in its original position. This forensic analysis transforms a simple rock into a dense case file. We are no longer just looking at a boundary, we are reconstructing the human drama that surrounded it. We can see the desperate swipe of a plow that nudged it year after year, or the deliberate blow of a hammer that tried to obliterate a royal name. These silent sentinels have much to say about the timeless human struggle between the desire for order and the temptation of deceit, providing the ultimate evidence for our entire exploration. From that first rough-hewn rock to the cunningly deceptive monument, these stones were never passive markers. They were active participants in the grand drama of history, reflecting our deepest human needs for order, for identity, and at times for deception. Our journey has taken us through their many layers of meaning. We have seen them as legal contracts carved in stone, as sacred objects pulsing with divine spirit, and as political tools projecting the raw power of an empire. We have unraveled the calculated reasons they were so often designed to mislead, from Hannibal's military ambushes and the greedy land grabs of wealthy nobles to the psychological warfare of paranoid pharaohs. These silent sentinels teach us a profound and enduring lesson that borders are human inventions. They are fraught with the same complexities, the same burning ambitions, and the same moral failings as the people who created them. They remind us that the desire to define our space is a fundamental human impulse, but so is the powerful temptation to quietly redefine it for our own advantage. As you look at the world today, with its own contested boundaries and endlessly debated maps, carry this thought with you. Remember the lessons from these ancient stones, that every line drawn is a story of power, of faith, or of fear, and behind every official story, there may be a long-buried secret. Thank you for joining this exploration into the hidden history written at the very edges of empires. If this journey through the geography of deception intrigued you, please subscribe for more historical mysteries. We would love to hear which ancient deception surprised you the most, so please share your thoughts in the comments